Imagine a world where we have mastered what it means to educate the common person. Each student reaches competency in every content area imaginable. We've somehow learned how to create a classroom that is always engaging and drives our learning, innovation, and creativity forward.
Our new generation would dream up and create technology, art, products, entertainment, food, and ideas that we haven't even imagined. Our mathematicians would have cracked the code to every unsolved equation. Our engineers would have constructed a spaceship that travels seamlessly at the speed of light. Imagine that even our musicians and artists managed to unravel the very essence of what it means to make something beautiful.
We could educate the most intelligent generation in history. But the sad truth is that if this generation, in all of its brilliance, lacked a sense of moral identity, our world would be in disarray. It may seem like something advanced and exciting, this technologically sound society, but in actuality, this sort of world would be far from ideal, having created an ingenious generation without morals, meaning, and direction.
So this begs the question, what is the true purpose of education? And if morality truly is salient, then how do we possibly teach such a thing? At our conference, we plan to make the case that moral behavior flows from a person's sense of self and identity. Beloved Devo instructor Dan Lapsley often says that moral identity is the only real predictor of moral behavior. So we plan to offer ways to help students engage in positive behaviors by invoking that sense of self. Instead of our conference seeking to weed out bad behaviors, we plan to address morality at its very roots, focusing on the self as the aim of education. To provide a brief overview, we will first give some background history on the foundations of moral identity research. Plan to introduce our 3 key findings in the literature. Then finally, we'll wrap up by providing you with some practical research-based interventions to help encourage that pro-social behavior in our students. Hope that this conference can be relevant to you as teachers, but also just for anyone and any one of our audience members who is a parent or a caregiver as well. So Suzy, pass it off to you to talk about some background history.
Thanks, Jaret. The idea of the moral self as the aim of education has become increasingly relevant in the past couple of decades. At the vanguard of this movement is contemporary developmental psychologist Augusto Blasi. Blasi counters the traditional Kohlberg approach to moral development, which focuses on stages of moral judgment as the crux of morality, and instead focuses on moral identity as the basis for moral development. Blasi suggests that morality is essential to the understanding of the self. Further, he claims that once a person has established a moral identity, the faculties by which they can actually act morally, such as willpower and integrity, are activated. Unless moral identity is established beforehand, these faculties will remain, as Blasi says, neutral. While there are alternative frameworks for moral development in the context of education, we find that Blasi's approach is far more generalizable and thus will be the basis of our research. Let's hear what the experimental research says.
Thanks, Suzy. So remember, our focus is on how we can invoke our students' sense of identity in order to catalyze those pro-social behaviors. So the good news with this agenda is that humans are intrinsically motivated to seek a valued identity. A 2010 study even found that you could pretty accurately predict how likely someone was to show up at the voting booth simply by invoking that identity. They surveyed 2 groups and they asked the first group, how important is it for you to be a voter? They asked the second group, how important is it for you to vote? And those in the first group were far more likely to vote. I think that this is because of that desire to take on a valued identity of voter. So here I want to talk about a 2014 study that attempted to replicate this idea with children as young as age 3. They wanted to see if they could invoke the sense of self in children in order to encourage helping behaviors. So the researchers hypothesized that using identity-relevant noun language like helper would have a greater effect on children's behavior than if they used the verb language of helping. So in the design of the study, children ages 3 to 6 participated. They gave instructions to the two different groups, either, like I said, using that helper language or helping language. And after reinforcing that, the children were shown 2 attractive toys. They were invited to play. When they were fully engaged playing with the toys, the experimenter provided the children with 4 opportunities to help. So let's take a look here at what they found. As you can see on the y-axis, the dependent variable here was the proportion of children that helped on the given topic. Give you a second to take a look at that. And then here on the x-axis, you see the independent variable, which, as stated, was whether the child received the identity-relevant noun language, or whether they received that, or the verb language, or the control. So the conclusion here that the researchers made is that even at this young age, children are motivated to take on those valued identities. So now I'm going to pass it off to Criss to talk about our next relevant finding.
Thanks, Jaret. Let's take a moment now to think about purpose. Every word we say, action we take, and perhaps even thoughts we consider have a purpose. Why does that matter? Well, the nature of our purpose could predict positive outcomes. In their study, Jaeger et al. Found that possessing a self-transcendent purpose was linked to greater academic regulation. Self-transcendent purpose is defined as the potential to have some effect on or connection to the world beyond the self. In other words, those with a self-transcendent purpose have a desire to engage in pro-social behaviors. This self-transcendent purpose is another way to conceptualize the establishment of moral identity, as it requires an individual to develop and commit to a given moral outcome. Now, Jaeger and colleagues hypothesized that students with a self-transcendent purpose for learning, as opposed to a self-oriented purpose, would demonstrate greater academic persistence and diligence. They tested this hypothesis in 4 experimental studies, in which one of these involved a self-transcendent purpose intervention, wherein one group of students were prompted to consider social issues they care about and connect their academic performance to self-transcendent contributions, while the other group was placed in a control condition. The researchers then measured academic performance by students' STEM GPAs in the grading period after the intervention. The results showed that those who received the intervention achieved higher STEM grades. This effect was made even stronger for students with lower GPAs originally. In line with Blasi's theory, perhaps these students' willpower faculty was activated by their desire to contribute to the world. They recognized the possibility of a helpful contribution, so they regulated their behaviors accordingly. The 3 additional studies affirmed these results, showing that not only does the establishment of moral identity render pro-social behaviors then, but it can also lead to greater academic regulation. Nick, tell us about your study.
Thanks, Criss. Hardy built on previous notions of moral identity to test just how much the centralization of morality predicts positive and negative behaviors among adolescents. In his empirical model, Hardy reconceptualized moral identity as part of the possible selves literature, a marriage that he believed had the potential for furthering understanding of moral identity. Hardy, in some ways, inserts himself into the classic Platonic and Aristotelian debates on ethics. Is merely identifying as a moral person and knowing what your virtues are, is that going to elicit moral behaviors, as the traditional identity research suggests? Or is envisioning yourself as a certain person in the future, giving yourself an ideal moral identity that you work towards, is that a more effective means to a pro-social end? Hardy's study looked at if operationalizing moral identity from this framework was predictive of morally relevant action. He also looked at what the mediators were between the ideal self and behavior. he got two important results. First, he found that the ideal moral self tapped into a motivational dimension among adolescents that predicted behavior. As we can see, if we look at the table, the moral ideal self variable was negatively predictive of aggression and cheating, and positively predictive of altruism and moral personality. What's interesting is that simply having a moral identity, as seen in this table, was negatively predictive of altruism and hardly predictive of moral personality. Second, he found that the relations between a possible self and one's actions were mediated by adolescents' sense of purpose and social responsibility. During the process of identity formation, the more adolescents commit to being moral people, the more they might gain a sense of purpose in life and greater social responsibility, as you can see on the bubble map on the screen. Thus, purpose and social responsibility may be the key to the motivating power of moral identity. Overall, Hardy found that our image of the type of person we want to be serves as a goal pulling us forward. This study confirmed Hardy's prior findings, which showed that the more adolescents commit to being moral people, the more they should improve their behavior, well-being, and interactions with others. Now let's hear about our first intervention from Jaret.
What are some ways that we can make this research actionable in our classes? As stated previously, teachers have a powerful role in influencing our students' identity. So with this influence, we first believe that praising students in a way that aligns with positive values and roles is important. You all were such great helpers today. Everyone in this classroom is a strong and capable learner. Even referring to your students each day as saints or as future saints could be more powerful than even saying something like the goal of classes is college in heaven. Because with college in heaven, okay, those are both places, but to call someone a saint, well, that's an identity that I'd like to take on. So in addition to this type of praise, we think that creating classroom roles could be a powerful tool to help encourage behavior in class. So you'd be surprised at just how small of a role it takes for children to get excited. Last year, I had the role of date writer, which was simply the person who came in each morning and changed the date on the whiteboard. So even with something like this, the children really gravitated and competed for, who got to be the date writer for the day. So we encourage you to create roles in your class that they value. So they can be something as big as prayer leader. So having someone who starts the prayer with the sign of the cross each day, or something subtle like the bell ringer. So the student who rings the bell and then initiates a transition. So there are plenty of ways. We encourage you to get creative and to come up with roles or jobs that can help benefit your classroom environment. So now to you, Suze.
Thanks for that helpful strategy, Jaret. As a fifth grade teacher, I find that my students are hard pressed to connect with abstract concepts of moral identity. Thus, an intervention for them must be both practical and simple. Just as Jaeger demonstrated, I will implement a self-transcendent purpose intervention with my students at the beginning of the year and revisit it throughout. This would require the following steps, mostly implemented over the first 2 weeks of school for about 15 minutes a day. Step 1. During the first week of school, I will give my students space and time to share about a social issue they care about. I will prompt students to consider a broad range of issues through picture books, news articles, etc. Students will write about one issue of their choosing in their writing journals. Step 2, after exploring these issues and landing on one they really care about, I'll offer examples of leaders who, around my students' age, made positive contributions to the world. I would even provide quotes from these leaders which explicitly state how their learning in school connected to their positive contributions. This way, students will see that the possibility of making a contribution, even at such a young age, very much exists. Step 3. I would have my students write a letter to a younger student wherein they would explain why they choose to learn and how learning will help them become the kind of person they want to be. This would help them to internalize their purposes. Step 4. Throughout the year, I would have my students think back to that social issue they wrote about in their journals. I will ask them to provide ways in which their learning in school might help them contribute to that goal. I will hold these discussions immediately after the progress report period so that students have a basis for where they can improve. I believe that this self-transcendent purpose intervention will motivate my St. Mary's students to persist through the trials and tedium of academics.
My intervention takes inspiration from a pair of professors at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, Dr. Tanya Bach and Dr. Heidi Geibel. They heed advice from the eponymous saint of their employer to advocate for integrating Thomistic virtue ethics into the classroom. Now, I know what you're thinking. Are you really going to teach the Summa to a bunch of fifth graders? The truth is, this intervention is nowhere near that intense. Using their Aristotelian, Thomistic, moral ideal self framework, with a few minor tweaks, my fifth graders at St. Clair of Montefalco Catholic School will be asked to commit to practicing virtues that they aspire to possess. This ideal self approach, if we remember from the Hardy study, is advantageous when reflected upon because it evokes a sense of motivation and/or obligation. Here's how this will look in my class. Early in the year, students will take the Values in Action Character Strength Survey to figure out their character strengths and weaknesses. Once they get their results, students will pick 4 of these virtues and rank them in terms of importance. This precise moment is where the evocation of a moral ideal self begins. Each quarter, students will pick one of these virtues that they want to commit to improving. This commitment starts with a virtues notebook. Each morning, my students' bell work will be done in this notebook, where they may be asked to respond to a prompt or a video or a scenario in which they could practice their chosen virtue. At the end of each day, just prior to dismissal, they will reflect on how well they practiced that virtue that day. Then, on Friday afternoons, students will take a bit more time to reflect on their entire week. They'll go back and read their bell work and their dismissal work and ask themselves, how well did I commit to my virtue this week? And make plans to commit to it better in the next week. And now let's hear from Criss.
Thanks, Nick. As these scholars have shown, there are many positive benefits, such as positive moral behaviors and academic achievement, that stem from adopting this moral self-identity. Another positive implication of the self-transcendent purpose is greater emotional regulation, specifically in relation to major depressive disorder symptoms. So in a 2014 study, Mayu and Yeager showed that it is possible to decrease the occurrence of depressive symptoms by targeting the socio-emotional learning of students entering high school. And with a persisting prevalence of depression among students entering high school, these researchers sought out to discover if part of this prevalence is due to these students believing in the fixedness of personal traits amidst a time of frequent social setbacks. Ultimately, Mayu and Yeager designed a socio-emotional intervention that reduced the incidence of self-reported depressive symptoms by nearly 40% among adolescents in the intervention group. Additionally, those who were in the non-intervention and who believed personality was static, believing people cannot change, showed greater increases in depressive symptoms during the year. So the results from this study are significant and have implications for why the moral self-identity yields positive emotional regulation outcomes. And for this reason, I suggest a similar intervention in which students engage in a weekly self-administered reading and writing activity as part of English or religion class. What this looks like is my students will read a story emphasizing the idea that A, if you are excluded or victimized, it is not due to a fixed personal deficiency on your part, and B, people who exclude or victimize you are not fixed bad people, but instead have complicated motivations that are subject to change. After reading the story, students will then write their own version of such a narrative that they will share with another classmate. The aim of the intervention is for students to recognize and understand that personality is ever changing. With this, My middle schoolers at St. Peter Claver should be better equipped to adapt to the incessant changes occurring in their lives, having to do with their families, school, friends, and personal development. To relate back to Jaret's intervention, it's important to note that even students' unvalued identities can change and that they can always strive towards a more positive identity. Being better able to adjust to these changes with a growth mindset could lead to decreases in mental health symptoms and increases in moral behaviors. And in the long term, we hope that our kids not only exhibit a decrease in negative moral behaviors, such as not having unprotected sex, but also increases in positive moral behaviors, such as helping others in class and participating in service opportunities. To move on from this point, we want to wrap up our discussion with a couple leading questions that we hope you will ponder moving forward. So for one, is it the responsibility of the teacher or of the family to teach ethics, given the debates on moral relativism and subjectivity?
On the one hand, as guests in a new community with different life experiences than our students and their families, is it overstepping our bounds to impose our definitions of morality in the classroom? On the other hand, should we even lend credence to moral subjectivity in our Catholic schools? The Catholic tradition supports a belief in the transcendentals of objective truth and goodness. Is teaching about this our prerogative?
Now for our second question. Think about how morality is taught in your school. Is it explicitly or implicitly taught? Do you feel that this approach is effective? And if not, how could you enhance it? Being in a Catholic school, we are uniquely positioned to teach on morality in the way that other schools may not be. How can we use our additional freedom to speak more explicitly on moral principles to our advantage? We hope you enjoyed our presentation, and we will hear from you soon at our live Q&A. Thank you.